Okay, first of all, I'd like to thank you for having me, and I'd like to thank everybody around the world for attending. This is a great honor and a privilege, really, to have such a large international audience for my topic. I wanted to tell you a little bit about how I got to this before I get into the meat of the story. As Tadeusz mentioned, I wrote a book a number of years ago called Jewish People, Yiddish Nation, about a prominent Jewish cultural activist and Yiddish scholar, politician in Poland named Noah Prilutsky. And Prilutsky ended his life as the chair for Yiddish at the University of Vilnius. The Lithuanian government created a chair for Yiddish at the University of Vilnius, which used to be, of course, the city of Vilna in Poland until World War II. And then when the Soviets took over, they actually made a chair. But then the Germans arrived in the summer of 1941, and the Gestapo killed Prilutsky. And this is really how my book ends. And of course, I really wanted to know more about what actually happened. And I came across a footnote in a book on linguistics in the Third Reich by the scholar Chris Hutton, in which I found a footnote saying that a Yiddish scholar, an ethnic German named Franz Belenick, was probably linked to the death of Prilutsky. After all, how would the Gestapo know to come after him specifically if they didn't know something about the Yiddish cultural scene already in Vilna, and that he probably provided the information? I started to pursue this link. I spent years pursuing it. I have not yet found an actual connection. But what I did discover was this fascinating story of the intersecting and parallel careers of four Yiddish scholars, two Jewish scholars of Yiddish and two ethnic Germans, beginning in the 1920s and really continuing into the 1960s. That's become the subject of the book that I'm writing now. And what you're going to be hearing today is a part of this. I'm going to be focusing on the interactions of Franz Balanik, who became really the first professor in post-war Germany, focusing on Yiddish in his research and his teaching, his relationship with the two most prominent Yiddish scholars of the 20th century, the men whose survival of the Holocaust really enabled Yiddish studies to take off in the English-speaking world, Max Weinreich and Solomon Birnbaum. So without further ado, I will get to the subject. Okay, and I have lots of slides to show you as we go through this voyage. In late June 1946, Max Weinreich, the co-director and a co-founder of the Yiddish Scientific Institute, YIVO, received word in New York City that Franz Balanik was looking for him. From Bellstadt, Germany, Balanik had inquired with an office for Jewish refugees in Geneva about the welfare of Weinreich and other YIVO workers. By coincidence, only a few months earlier, Weinreich had asked in a letter to his son Uriel, who was then a US Army soldier in Germany, that he seek out Belenics' 1941 book, Die Jiddische Mundart Nordostungarns. This was a study of the phonology of Yiddish in Carpatho-Ruthenia, a region annexed to Hungary in 1939 after the dismantlement of Czechoslovakia. While he needed the book, Weinreich spurned its author. Weinreich wrote to his son, then in the US Army, "My demand would be to tell him that the government that paid him murdered the largest part of those people and to try him for complicity." Now, of course, you can see Weinreich as a middle-aged scholar on the left and his son Uriel, who became the first chair in Yiddish at Columbia, the first chair in North America for Yiddish on the right, famous for his textbook, College Yiddish, and many other works of Yiddish scholarship. I'll show you Balanik in just a moment. This, of course, raises the question, who was Franz Balanik? The name you probably never heard. As if anticipating this question, Weinreich explained that he was an ethnic German expelled from Czechoslovakia in the wake of the collapse of Nazi Germany. When we knew him, Weinreich wrote, he was a teacher in a German gymnasium in the Sudetenland. Until 1945, was a docent in the German University in Prague. That is, he was one of Hitler's professors. He worked on Yiddish dialectology. In 1939, YIVO was in the process of publishing one of his studies about Yiddish in Carpatho-Ruthenia. In 1935, he was even with us at the YIVO World Congress in Vilna. Now I suspect that some Hitler Institute sent him. So Weinreich ended his letter to Uriel. Now, Max Weinreich lost nearly everyone and everything of importance to him during World War II. He was one of 10 children. About 6 of his siblings were killed, as well as, of course, friends, family, most of the staff of YIVO. Almost miraculously, his wife and younger son managed to join him and Uriel in New York during the war. But his firstborn, the YIVO Institute in Vilna, Poland, along with its personnel and much of its collections, fell victims to the Nazis and their accomplices. A refugee in 1940s New York City, Weinreich channeled his turbulent emotions into feverish industry. He was consumed with the task of transforming YIVO's American branch into its world headquarters and adapting its academic mission to the post-Holocaust reality in North America. For Weinreich, the contributions of German academics to the systematic destruction of Jewish lives and culture was not only a cause of limitless pain, it was also the source of a profound sense of personal betrayal. Among those who had lent their support to the Hitler regime were his mentors and colleagues at German language universities, as well as those to whom YIVO had provided moral, intellectual, and material support. Now, what you can see on the left is YIVO shortly before the war, when it had its own building, and what you see on the right is, of course, the remains of YIVO after the war. In the early months of 1946, Weinreich was putting the finishing touches on his book, Hitler's Professors, the part of scholarship in Germany's crimes against the Jewish people. The study was prepared for use in the Nuremberg trials. It represents a radical departure from the study of Yiddish language and the sociology and psychology of Eastern European Jewry, with which Weinreich had earned an international reputation. Published less than a year after the war's end, Hitler's Professors relied on Nazi publications collected by YIVO during the war and captured archival materials to indict collectively the academics of the Third Reich for their contribution in providing the intellectual foundations and legitimization for the recent genocide of European Jewry. For Weinreich, these scholars had willfully perverted the purpose of Judaica scholarship. They had transformed it from an instrument for the sake of improving lives into one for the express purpose of destroying them. Now, remarkably, I'll just note, this book was actually written first in English by Weinreich. He later translated himself into Yiddish, precisely because he wanted this to be available for the Nuremberg trials. Weinreich's opprobrium was not limited to scholars who had engaged in so-called Judenforschung. That is, it was not limited to those who had conducted research for Nazi and Nazified institutions bearing the appearance of objective scholarship, but whose conclusions were subordinate to the dictates of anti-Semitic ideology. Weinreich questioned German scholars who approached him about their activities during the war and refused contact with anyone who could not demonstrate to his satisfaction their distance from the Third Reich's institutions. His position was long YIVO's official one, and his stature in the field also influenced scholars outside of YIVO. His position was, however, not the only one amongst Jewish scholars of Yiddish, nor was it the only position held privately by those active in YIVO. It contrasts most strikingly with that of his colleague Solomon Birnbaum, who was not a YIVO scholar. The two most accomplished Yiddish linguists of their generation, Weinreich and Birnbaum, were products of the same German academic tradition and found refuge from Nazi Germany's aggressive policies in the English-speaking world. Weinreich in New York and Birnbaum in London. Yet Birnbaum not only aided Balanik after World War II, but mentored a new generation of German scholars of Yiddish who came of age after the fall of the Nazi regime, thereby helping to establish post-war Germany as a center for Yiddish research. In his final years, at the age of nearly 95, Birnbaum traveled from his home in Toronto, Canada, to Germany to accept an honorary doctorate from the Yiddish chair at the University of Trier in recognition of a lifetime of contributions to the fields of Yiddish. Now, what you see on the left is Birnbaum as a young man. On the right is his father, Nathan Birnbaum, most famous for coining the term Zionism, leaving the Zionist movement, becoming a Yiddishist, eventually becoming active in Agudat Israel. On the little boy on the left is Jacob Birnbaum, one of Solomon's sons, who became one of the founders of the movement on behalf of Soviet Jewry in the 1960s. On the right is a picture in Hamburg during the interwar period when Berenbaum was a professor there of Yiddish at the University of Hamburg, sitting with his brother Menachem. I'll tell you about Menachem a little bit later, Menachem's wife, and Weinreich's wife. Weinreich had gone to Hamburg and he was to visit, and he was the one taking the photo. Solomon Birnbaum grew up in Vienna, apart from a few years in the Habsburg city of Czernowitz in today's Ukraine, then home to a large Yiddish-speaking population. He was the eldest son of Nathan Birnbaum, an important Jewish thinker and cultural activist, perhaps best known for coining the term Zionism. Like Weinreich, who was born in today's Latvia, Solomon Birnbaum was a native speaker of German who acquired near-native facility in Yiddish as an adolescent and wrote his doctorate about Yiddish in a German university. For him too, the language and its culture was more than merely a subject of scholarly interest. He was, however, not a Yiddishist like Weinreich and other Yivo scholars in the sense of being a secular nationalist committed to Yiddish as the foundation of Jewish identity. The language was rather a part of a larger commitment to religious orthodoxy as the reason for and guarantor of Jewish uniqueness. Yiddish, he maintained, had come into being as the expression of Ashkenazic Jews' all-encompassing religious cultural way of life. The goal of the predominantly leftist Yiddishist movement to transform a language that had for centuries conveyed religious thought and feeling into an instrument of consciously secular culture smacked to him of assimilation, if not idolatry. Now, the photo you see here is a photo of the Brinbaums family in Hamburg in 1932. At this point, they had 3 children, all of whom went on to quite remarkable lives. A 4th child was born in England a few years later. Philological, coupled with practical interest in Yiddish in the aftermath of World War I, helped to create the circumstances for a position in Yiddish that Birnbaum held at the University of Hamburg from 1922 until 1933. Birnbaum fled Germany for Holland in May 1933, and then took refuge with his family in England, where his wife Irene had been raised. With great effort, he managed to establish himself at the University of London as a lecturer in 2 areas in which he was a pioneering scholar: Hebrew paleography and epigraphy, and in Yiddish. From London, Birnbaum maintained relationships with scholars in the German-speaking world and beyond. Among those with whom he generously shared his expertise and publications in the 1930s was Franz Belenick, a young Moravian scholar whose research focused on German dialects spoken in enclaves in or neighboring non-German language territory. Despite his Czech surname, Balanik identified very much as a German, having grown up in an enclave in a German-speaking enclave in a predominantly Czech-speaking region. As elsewhere in the Czech lands, intermarriage between linguistic communities had become quite common prior to the widespread politicization of national identity in the 19th century. His hometown of Lundenburg, or Breslau, was also home to a sizable Jewish population. This ethnic and linguistic diversity would play a decisive role in shaping Belenics' intellectual interests and political orientation. Balanik related to Birnbaum how he planned to conduct research about dialects of colonial German and of Yiddish during a vacation in Carpatho-Ruthenia in 1933. But his primary interest in Yiddish resided in its nearly extinct Western branch, which he noted was still recalled amongst the older generation of Jews in the Sudetenland. Balanik lamented his intellectual isolation and the lack of resources for his work about what he called, quote, this highly interesting speech form of German, end quote. According to him, his work on Yiddish earned him only condescending smiles from professors of German philology at the German University in Prague. Balanik and Birnbaum exchanged a few letters prior to World War II. Now, after nearly a decade of silence, Birmbaum was greatly surprised in the summer of 1947 when he noticed an announcement in an American journal about Balanik's book about Yiddish in the easternmost part of pre-war Czechoslovakia. And this is what you see here, the cover page of the book and the introductory page where there is a note thanking not a Nazi institution. I'll explain in just a moment. What particularly piqued his interest was the publication date, 1941, in the thick of the war. Birnbaum was eager to learn the circumstances of the book's publication, its scholarly reception, and its consequences for the author. He therefore welcomed a letter from Bernick reintroducing himself after the war. While making no explicit mention of the Holocaust, Balanik expressed in his letter the hope that Birnbaum had, quote, placed the evil years behind him, end quote. He explained that he had been a docent at the German Charles University in Prague until 1945, when he was driven from his home and forced to leave behind his library and research materials. Now a high school teacher in a small town in Hesse, Germany, he lacked adequate access to an appropriate research library. He implored Birnbaum to update him about the field of Yiddish and to share duplicates of published works with him. He also shared his ambitious plans for research and hopes with Birnbaum's support to attract German government support for Yiddish research. Balanik noted that he had written twice to Yivo in New York City and once personally to Max Weinreich, but never received a response. Anticipating the reason for this silence, Balanik requested that Birnbaum intercede on his behalf with Yivo. He wrote the following to Birnbaum. I can naturally understand to a degree if one wants to know nothing of official circles from Germany, but I would appreciate if an exception could be made for me, the only person with a scholarly interest in Yiddish in Germany today. Birnbaum obliged him by writing to Yivo. In late June 1948, he dutifully relayed the results of his inquiry to Balanik. The reasons for Yivo's negative attitude, he reported, are that, quote, your study was printed with the support of a Reichsinstitut für Geschichte des Neuen Deutschlands, that you speak in the foreword of the necessity of the new Germany, studying all things connected with Jews, that you advanced professionally during the war, that you drew a salary from the government that exterminated the Jewish people, that you expressed your gratitude to the Institute and its president, Walter Frank, at the end of the foreword, end quote. In short, Yivo objected to Balanik's involvement with an institution devoted to anti-Semitic Judenforschung. Founded in 1935 to encourage historical research from a National Socialist perspective, Walter Frank's Reichsinstitut for the History of the New Germany competed with Alfred Rosenberg's notorious Institute for Research on the Jewish Question for dominance in the field of Nazi research about the Jewish question. Now, Birnbaum had himself spent the war years conducting top secret work in the Uncommon Languages Division under the auspices of the British War Office. There, he read thousands of letters in Jewish languages to help the British obtain information useful to the war effort and about conditions in occupied lands. He was thus painfully aware of events in Europe and elsewhere throughout the war, including the suffering of his relatives. Only after the war, however, did he obtain confirmation of the death of his beloved brother Menachem, a talented illustrator, and his family in Auschwitz. What you see on the left is one of his brothers. This is Menachem. He was an illustrator, as I mentioned. The other brother, who was an illustrator and a poet, Uriel, survived. Birnbaum wrote the following to Balanik. It is obviously not easy for you there to understand to what extent one must understand the negative attitude of Jewish circles for everything connected to Germany. The blood and torture of 6 million, and among them fathers, mothers, brothers, sisters, daughters, sons, are something that, apart from other feelings, dictates a natural attitude of mistrust of every German, even when it is known that they were opponents of the Nazis for a long time. All the more so when, on the one hand, the religious man hears nothing of a great and deep remorse among the German people, and on the other hand, every observer of natural fact sees that the great mass of Nazis and other Jew haters is still there, has not given up its views, and sooner rather than later would like to repeat it all, end quote. Balanik did not reject any of these accusations other than that his career had advanced during the war, nor did he deny the validity of such feelings. But he felt that, as he put it, quote, much looks different from the other side of the Atlantic, end quote. He maintained that Weinreich's position was unjustly simplistic, as it reflected a deep lack of understanding for the position of the individual in the Nazi dictatorship. He hoped that from Birnbaum, he could expect what he called, quote, a certain degree of understanding as far as authoritative circles were concerned, for the very difficult and above all, highly differentiated situation in Germany during the past years, end quote. Far from being an agent of Nazi persecution of Jews, Balanik understood himself as a victim, first of discrimination against the German minority in interwar Czechoslovakia, secondly, of the pro-Nazi Sudeten German party that had granted him only a, what he called very inferior high school teaching position in 1938 because he was not a party member. Thirdly, of the Nazi state itself. He alleged that Nazi Germany had reproached him with his Judenfreundlich, his philo-Semitic orientation of his research, placed him under surveillance, and prevented him from becoming an associate professor. Fourthly, he was a victim of the indiscriminate expulsion of ethnic Germans from Czechoslovakia after World War II. And finally, he was a continuing victim of Jewish prejudice. His choice of a publisher for his study of Carpatho-Ruthenian Yiddish was not a reflection of allegiance to Nazi ideology, he maintained. Rather, it reflected a mixture of idealism and pragmatism. Offering thanks to Nazi Walter Frank, whom he had never met, was an unavoidable act of courtesy. In Balanik's words, I was referred to the Reichsinstitute and its funding, which is all that mattered to me. The amazing thing happened. It defrayed all the costs of publication. When I wrote in the introduction that everything connected to Jews must be researched, it is clear from context and content what I meant. Not economic and other matters always concerning Verjudung, Jewification, but literally the unique cultural foundations of Judaism, above all the Yiddish language. But while seemingly towing the official line, I offered an invitation to a new land that lies far from politics and hate, end quote. In the end, Balanik continued, the book had found favor neither with the Nazi party nor with reviewers. He asked Berenbaum, quote, can he who reproaches me tell me what I should have done? To leave service and enter a concentration camp? End quote. Balanik maintained that in his words, he did not lack courage despite that I was an employee of the state. This could be confirmed by his continuing to correspond with Yivo until 1940, and by a statement affirming that he had intervened on behalf of a missioning, a student of mixed Jewish background, who was being disciplined for his Jewish descent. Finally, to make matters worse, prior to his expulsion from Czechoslovakia, a Jewish functionary had confiscated his scholarly materials. Birnbaum was certainly no stranger to Nazi brutality and coercion. As he explained to his sons years later, ordinary people living under such horrible conditions were little inclined to be heroes. He professed what he called his full understanding for the position of both Balanik and Weinreich, these two apparently irreconcilable positions. Nonetheless, it is difficult not to hear a tone of reproach in Birnbaum's words when he adds, quote, perhaps you can empathize precisely because you know yourself to be an anti-Nazi who demonstrated personal courage against the Nazis, and yet you are indignant not to be recognized for it by the Yiddish Scientific Institute, end quote. Balanik thanked Birnbaum for his efforts and affirmed his commitment to what he called the cause of Yiddish research. With a tone of resignation, he noted his worry that, quote, The gap between Yivo's work and mine will only grow deeper and prove more calamitous than that between the so-called Western and Eastern European scholarship, end quote. This was their last exchange between them concerning Belenic's World War II activities and his relationship with Yivo, although their correspondence continued nearly until Belenic's death in 1967. Birmbaum contributed a short notice to the journal Mitteilungen aus dem Arbeitskreis für Yadistic, which Balanik launched and edited from 1955 to 1964. The first of its kind in Germany, the journal aimed to promote research about Yiddish among German-speaking academics and to generate support for the creation of a chair for the language in a German university. In an oblique reference to collective responsibility for the Holocaust, Balanik called upon German scholars in the journal's inaugural issue to preserve the language before it disappeared, and in recognition of what he called, quote, the disastrous role in its decline with which fate has burdened the German people, end quote. The journal, he announced, would hopefully be a step toward intellectual reconciliation between Jews and Germans. Among its contributors and those listed as endorsing its work were several who had been active in Nazi research and academic networks. They include Heinz Kloss, whom you see on the left, who became a leader in the field of minority language studies after the war and spent some time here in Canada, and Johannes Poll, who you see on the right, who became an editor for the Duden series of language books in post-World War II Germany. Today, he is well known for his role in pillaging Yivo's collections in Vilna and using its scholars as slave laborers to sort materials and conduct research in the service of the notorious Rosenberg Stab that pillaged Jewish libraries throughout Europe. It is unlikely that Birnbaum was wholly convinced of Belenic's explanations, even if he believed it possible that Belenik was not an ideological Nazi. Among the letters in the Belenik-Birnbaum correspondence lies an article from the New York Yiddish Studies titled The Excuses of German Yiddish Researcher Franz Balanik. Now, before I show you that article and explain, let me just show you, this is a book that was edited by Balanik that was purchased by Archives Canada in 2018. It's a study of these media and various organizations of the Jews in North America, the US and Canada, that was acquired from Hitler's personal library. So this is the Heinz Kloss, the famous linguist I'm talking about. Only in recent years is his Nazi past finally beginning to really come into the public light. Now back to this article. This is an article that Max Weinreich published in the early 1950s about Franz Balanik in the Yiddish Daily Vollblatt in New York. It appeared in March 1956, written by Weinreich under one of his regular pseudonyms, P. Berman. Birnbaum was thus at least aware of the acrimonious exchange that occurred between Weinreich and Balanik on the pages of the Vollblatt after it published an article about Balanik's Yiddish Studies journal. And there was really a series of articles that went back and forth on the page of the Vollblatt where Weinreich demasked and accused Balanik, and Balanik replied in translation. Someone translated him into Yiddish. Weinreich denounced Balanik in two articles in the Vollblatt for what he considered the scholar's ample complicity with the Nazi regime, repeating the accusations he had leveled against him almost a decade earlier via Birnbaum. Dripping with sarcasm, the articles attacked one by one Balanik's defenses of his wartime activities and condemned his alleged goals in promoting Yiddish as self-serving lies and distortions. According to Weinreich, they were an attempt to whitewash his conduct and to create a position in Yiddish for himself in post-World War II German academia. Referring to Nazi documents that Yivo had acquired, Weinreich pointed out that Balanik had enthusiastically agreed to attend a Nazi-sponsored academic conference for Eastern questions and recommended that his wife, a folklorist for the research division of the SS, be invited too. He also contributed a book review to Nazi ideologue Alfred Rosenberg's anti-Semitic journal Weltkampf. His denazification certificate, issued by a German court, was in Weinreich's opinion simply laughable. So was a letter that he alleged that Bernick had himself written from the student whom he had defended for being a Mischling. Despite Bernick's claims that his Yiddish-related publications made him suspect in the party's eyes and endangered him, Weinreich continued, Balanik was able to advance from the rank of a high school teacher in 1938 to the position of an assistant professor and to assume a position for Moravian folklore at the German Charles University in Prague in 1944. Further, Balanik unself-consciously used tainted Nazi terminology in his attempts to defend himself. What you see on the left is the certificate of the German court exonerating Balanik of guilt of complicity with the Nazi regime. On the right is the letter that was supposedly written by a student of his whom he defended as a Mischling. And I'll say something about this later, but by the way, I think this letter on the right is actually authentic. I've tried to check the signature, and I think this is an authentic signature of the student who supposedly wrote this letter. In Belenics Rebuttal, also published in the Vorwärts, he did not categorically deny any of the information that Weinreich presented, other than the accusation that he hoped to receive money from foreign Jews to finance a Yiddish chair for himself. Indeed, he revealed more than Weinreich had alleged, namely that he'd been a Nazi party member, but he denied having any offices or functions in the party. But he disputed the interpretation of his record, rejecting Weinreich's accusations with more or less the same arguments that he gave in his letters to Birmbaum. Moreover, he elevated the publication of his 1941 study from a pragmatic act to a badge of honor. In his telling, he had managed to dupe an anti-Semitic institute into publishing a non-anti-Semitic study. The book's essentially benign introduction was a cleverly executed ploy to satisfy his patrons without harming Jews. While Yivo circles treated him with undeserved enmity, other Jewish scholars, among them Birnbaum, recognized the baselessness of such accusations and did not sever ties with him. Now, what can we make of Franz Belenick's accounting for his wartime career and Jewish responses to it? Belenick was certainly not the only scholar with a Nazi background to maintain a career in post-World War II German academia. He distinguishes himself, however, with what impresses as either sheer effrontery or utter detachment from reality by seeking to reestablish relations with Jewish scholars and to rebuild his career with their assistance immediately after the war. To the contemporary reader, it is clear that Weinreich was essentially correct. Balanik omitted, decontextualized, and distorted, indeed outright lied about, portions of his biography, while reacting with indignation to Weinreich's accusations and insisting upon his own status as a victim and a hero. What Weinreich was perhaps unaware of was the staggering extent to which he had done so. By many accounts, including Nazi ones, Balanik rubbed others the wrong way with his arrogance, aggressive ambition, and insensitivity to others. But he was deemed by Reich officials an eminently competent scholar and politically reliable. As early as 1933, while he conducted his research in Carpatho-Ruthenia, Czechoslovak police kept him under surveillance as a strident German nationalist suspected of activity on behalf of Nazi Germany. That is, they thought he was a spy for the Gestapo. He not only joined the Nazi Party in 1938, but was also a staff sergeant and press officer in the SA. His personal correspondence makes clear that he sought a research position in German-occupied Poland or anywhere else that would free him from teaching and permit him to conduct the work he considered most important. Indeed, he was later given leave from his high school teaching job in 1942 to 43 to direct a German research institute in Slovakia. The purpose of the institute was to stress the history of pre-Slavic German settlement in the region, thereby justifying German hegemony and eventually absorption into the Reich. Balanik did indeed draw the attention of the SD, the intelligence agency of the SS, but not in connection with pro-Jewish activities or his objective scholarship, what he considered his objective scholarship about Slavic languages, as he claimed in his personnel file after the war in the University of Gießen's archives. Rather, the cause was interpersonal frictions among personnel at the Institute, leading to his removal from it. The SD also conducted a background check when a project was to be entrusted to Bernick by the Institute for the Research on the Jewish Question. Indeed, far from suffering for his interest in Yiddish, he was recommended to become a Yiddish and Slavic specialist at the Anti-Semitic Institute für Deutsche Ostarbeit, a German research unit in occupied Krakow, Poland. Its director reviewed his 1941 book quite positively. In his CV submitted in 1943 to the German University in Prague, he boasted of having belonged to the most extreme anti-Jewish student group in the pre-Nazi era at the German University in Prague, of having received a medal for his participation in the Sudetenlands Union with Germany, and of Nazi research institutes competing for him. One is, however, hard-pressed to locate unambiguously anti-Jewish animus or willful distortions in his writing about Yiddish, Jews, and Judaism. The exceptions are a few lines in his book review published in an anti-Semitic journal and the introduction to his 1941 Yiddish study, which he evidently added to a work he had initially hoped to publish with YIVO prior to World War II. The Slavicists Dietrich Gerhardt and Munster, with whom Weinreich was on good terms, pointed out that Balanik had cited compromised scholars such as Hans Gunther, a racial researcher and eugenicist celebrated by the Nazis, in an article about Yiddish that he had clearly written before the war, but before the war's end, but published only afterwards. But after meeting Balanik personally, Gerhardt found him self-aggrandizing, but he quoted, but more, as he put it, naive than malicious. In the evaluation of historian Alan Steinweis, Balanik was, quote, incapable of recognizing that his scholarly work about Yiddish bore any connection to the catastrophe that had made the language near extinct in Europe, end quote. Now, on the other hand, Balanik understood well enough that aspects of his wartime activities would undermine his attempts to rebuild an academic career. He omitted or lied about some of the most damning details of his biography as part of his post-war self-fashioning and dropped references to Jews as a race, now a taboo subject, in his subsequent writings. His work in the field of Yiddish and his pre-war relations with Jews now served as evidence of his distance from Nazi ideology. His personnel file in the archives of the University of Gießen contained a wealth of documents about his education and career prior to and during the war years, documents he needed to obtain employment as a high school teacher in post-World War II Germany, and his position at the University of Gießen in the 1960s. Suspiciously absent from such a well-documented file are references to the aforementioned book review or any Nazi papers concerning his party membership and position in the party. Moreover, the assertion in his denazification certificate that he strenuously declined putting his scholarship in the service of politics is blatantly contradicted by his work in wartime Slovakia in a German research institute there. Most likely, Balanik was an opportunist with an abiding interest in Yiddish, but less so for Jews, either as individuals or as a collective, than as an object of research useful to the field of Germanic linguistics. Revealing his moral obtuseness, he even described to Birnbaum how in the pursuit of linguistic data, he often visited the rabbi of Trnava in Slovakia in a ghetto in 1943. Despite what he called all the difficulties in doing so, end quote. This was a time when Jews were being rounded up for internment and deportation in Slovakia. Similarly, he eagerly took advantage of the presence of DPs in post-war West Germany to collect additional data for his book, Das Pinsker Yiddish, which you see here. His post-war personal letters to friends and colleagues active in the network of Nazi ethnic researchers, Volkstumsforscher, revealed that he considered Germany's defeat and the loss of its eastern territories a catastrophe, and that he bemoaned that it would take time for post-World War II Germany to recognize the value of his work about ethnic Germans in those regions. Balanik's motivations mattered little, of course, to Weinreich. While Balanik insisted that he be judged above all by the content of his published work and his commitment to scholarship, Weinreich deemed the political context of his work equally, if not more significant. Balanik was, in his eyes, morally complicit, having used scholarship to unethical ends, and was attempting to obfuscate his actions. Service to an explicitly anti-Semitic regime, in whatever capacity, was for Weinreich a conscious choice, and he was reluctant to acknowledge extenuating circumstances or differing degrees of culpability. And even if Balanik could deny his wartime actions, Weinreich wrote in the Vorwärts, and I quote him, his arrogant tone and his absolute dullness in understanding the Jewish situation would be enough to keep a distance from him, end quote. In a 1947 article, Balanik stressed the moral duty of Germany, above all the field of Germanistic, German philology, to create a teaching and research facility to preserve the language before its likely disappearance. Such an act would not only reconfirm what he called the laudable reputation for universality that German scholarship enjoys, but also represent unsolicited intellectual amends to Jews as only a people of Dichter und Denker, of philosophers and poets can make, end quote. Weinreich, the ideological Yiddishist committed to studying the language from its own vantage point, rather from the margins of Germanistic, could only have regarded such a statement as irredeemably patronizing. Weinreich, the author of Hitler's Professors, must have deemed it grotesque. Yet despite his abhorrence for Balanik the man, Weinreich shared Birnbaum's respect for Balanik, the prolific scholar. He cited his indispensable research about Western Yiddish in his own work, even as he denigrated it privately as methodologically flawed and overreaching in its claims. And I'll add just a note today, Balanik's research is actually quite important for understanding the roots of contemporary spoken Hasidic Yiddish, which comes largely from the areas which he researched. Birmbaum concurred with Weinreich's sense of collective German guilt and lack of contrition, but was less categorical in condemning individuals. Birnbaum's response was no doubt conditioned as much by personal experience and temperament as by his knowledge of recent history. He treated Balanik as a colleague and publicly acknowledged his role in the resumption of Yiddish studies in German academia, even if he harbored doubts about his character, including his degree of empathy with Hitler's victims. Balanik became the first professor specializing in Yiddish in post-war Germany. Not long after he delivered his inaugural lecture about Yiddish and German philology at the University of Gießen in 1961, he thanked Birnbaum on the occasion of his 70th birthday. In a private letter, he noted that it was above all Birnbaum's interwar scholarship that had shown him what he called, quote, the thorny but therefore challenging path of Yiddish research, and thereby introduced a special position that I today occupy in German scholarship, end quote. As a final note, it may observe that Balanik shared with Weinreich and Birnbaum not only a fascination with Yiddish, but also a sense of loss for a world no more. His was, however, the world of Sudeten Germans, who shared his sense of victimhood and injustice. He translated this loss into concrete scholarship, directing the project for a dictionary of Sudeten German and creating an atlas of Sudeten German dialects based on interviews with fellow exilies in West Germany. And this is what you see on the right, the dictionary of Sudeten German. Ironically, at the same time, Weinreich was assisting his son Uriel in a parallel, albeit more extensive form of linguistic and cultural salvage work. Following the Holocaust, father and son were constructing, with the help of colleagues, the language and cultural atlas of Ashkenazic Jewry, which you see on the left, through interviews with surviving European Yiddish speakers scattered around the world. Thank you. I'll be happy to entertain your comments and questions. There's a lot I couldn't say. There's a lot I did say. This is a very big topic, so I apologize that I couldn't talk about all of the Nazi Yiddish scholars. There are a few others.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kalman, for your fascinating lecture. And yes, there is a first question I will address to you. Ron Scrimmeger is asking, is Yiddish a uniform language across the geography of old Europe and subsequently the USA? So it's not so much regarding the maybe lecture itself, but the language.
Okay, I'll answer that very briefly. What language is uniform? Only standardized languages are uniform. Yiddish, like all languages, has various dialects. So that's the short answer to the question, but those dialects are mutually intelligible. There are debates about the history of Yiddish, whether it has multiple origins or one origin. All dialects originate from that one origin, so to speak, polygenetic versus monogenetic theories, but I won't address that here. All dialects of Yiddish today, however, are mutually intelligible.
Yeah. Okay, another question. Ron is asking also regarding Yiddish. How are new words introduced into Yiddish? Like, for example, a laptop, Zoom meetings, recycling, and so on and so forth.
How are they introduced in any language? People start using them. Sometimes there are language academies that propose words. Yiddish does not have much of a language academy today. The YIVO in certain ways served as a language academy, for at least for those people who are willing to pay attention. Of course, all language academies only work to the extent that they have government authority or people who are willing to pay attention. But most of this is people who come up with the words. Either they think of them or through natural use. Obviously internationalisms like Zoom catch on easily. Words like laptop, people have proposed words. And like in any growing natural language, you have to see what word takes. There are Yiddishists, particularly secular Yiddishists, who propose words and try to use them as much as possible. Hasidic speakers, at least in North America, very often borrow from English, but they often change those words in some way or another and adopt them to their pronunciation. So I would say it's really the same story as virtually every other language. New words are arriving in Yiddish all the time.
Okay. Thank you very much. And another question, or kind of comment and question, I'm also sending to your direct chat room. Michael Goodman is asking or commenting, there is some local variations from country to country. For example, there is a variation in the word for street in Lithuanian Yiddish. What was the status of the Sorb language during the Third Reich?
What was the status of the Sorb language spoken in Eastern Slavic territory that became Germanized? Sorb, is that what you're asking about?
Yeah, this is what I understood as well.
Unfortunately, I'm not an expert. I can speak about Yiddish dialects, certainly. I don't, the Sorb language had virtually died out by the time of the Third Reich. But I couldn't tell you what the Third Reich's attitude toward this Slavic language that had become heavily Germanized. That's a very interesting question, however.
Yeah, indeed. But I guess probably it's gone by now. Okay, another question. Actually, Wanda is asking, reflecting to her grandparents who came at the beginning of 20th century to USA, and they never actually learned English. So they spoke Yiddish till the very end. Were there many non-Jews who are studying Yiddish, and why they are doing so?
Okay, so I'll actually take this question a step back, and then I'll bring it into connection with what I spoke about. People very often ask me, well, what was the Nazis' interest in Yiddish in general? And the truth is that the Nazis were not super interested in Yiddish as an ideological movement, but individual Nazis were. Individual scholars who became Nazis were interested in Yiddish. And the Nazis, some of them, they did begin to produce some positions for Yiddish, but there wasn't a lot of it. There were rumors circulating of spy schools that were training Germans to portray themselves as Jews, teaching them Yiddish in order they could infiltrate Jewish communities. There are a few stories like this, unsubstantiated. I haven't found any actual evidence of this. What I do know is that you had ethnic Germans from Eastern Europe who spoke Yiddish natively because they had grown up amongst Jews in places like, Eastern Slovakia, Carpatho-Ruthenia, that is, or in Ukraine or somewhere else, who were recruited into, the SS, and they used their knowledge of Yiddish to hunt Jews, to portray themselves as Jews, to lure them out with a sense of security, a fellow Jew was speaking to them, and to catch them this way. So this is one of the other ways that Yiddish was used, but there was not a mass mobilization of knowledge of Yiddish by the Nazis. I could go into that further, but I'll say that for now. Post-World War II, we have a new interest in Yiddish amongst non-Jews. The non-Jews who were interested in Yiddish prior to World War II tended to be scholars. The ones I mentioned were people who just grown up with it naturally. They weren't scholars. But there's a long history of German interests, particularly in Yiddish, that goes back to the early modern era. That's a whole story in itself. Post-World War II, we have increasing numbers of non-Jews who are interested in Yiddish, particularly in Germany and Eastern Europe, in those regions where Yiddish was historically spoken, such as Poland, Ukraine, Lithuania, and so on. What is to be said about this? I think it's a fantastic phenomenon that increasing numbers of non-Jews are interested in Yiddish, and that one of the things that has happened since the 1990s is the increased number of positions for Jewish studies, including Yiddish, in the formerly communist countries of Eastern Europe. So this is, really a remarkable phenomenon that I applaud. It's those scholars bring a certain degree of information, a certain knowledge and perspective that people in the usual suspect countries like the United States and Israel often lack, because they grew up in Slavic milieu and speak Slavic languages natively. And most of the Jewish scholars of Yiddish today do not, some of the Russians speak it obviously natively, but the real influence on Yiddish doesn't come from Russian. It comes from the other Slavic languages, because Jews came rather late to Russian. So, with this cross-fertilization, I think is something to be welcomed, in short.
Yeah, thank you very much. Before next question, actually, there is a comment from Michael Goodman regarding the Sorb language. He says that it is used, and actually it was revived by the East German regime. It's quite interesting, I have to
That's
say.
very interesting. Thank you for that. There's a whole question I'm interested in that I haven't gotten into is, I know something about Yiddish in post-World War II West Germany, but there's a parallel story with Yiddish in post-World War II East Germany that has not yet been told.
Yeah, there's a lot of much to discover. Okay, Nora Gold is asking actually more directly regarding your lecture. What is your point of view about Bernick? Is it your opinion closer to Birmbaum or Weinreich's?
Well, the question is, the question is really, what do you do with these people? I think I've made it abundantly clear that Balanik was a fervent German nationalist who used his skills to support the ideological aims of the Nazi regime. I think he was rather ambivalent or not indifferent to the fate of Jews. And he used his scholarship on Yiddish in part to launch his career post-World War II. The question is, what do you do with someone like this? If you are Weinreich, you exclude them from the circle of Yiddish researchers. You maybe put a note, but you use their research because all research is valuable. But you maybe put a note in your articles pointing out who he was. If you are Birnbaum, you accept him as a colleague and keep your suspicions largely to yourself. Something I couldn't really fit in here that I only discovered recently is that Birnbaum actually addressed this issue more explicitly in a letter to a Jewish linguist in Switzerland who was precisely faced with this question. A woman named Florence Guggenheim, who was a researcher of Swiss Yiddish, who said, listen, I'm a Jew here in the German-speaking regime, German-speaking territory post-World War II. I have to have business, so to speak, with Germans. This is the language I function in. How should I respond to these people? And she went back and forth with Weinreich and Birnbaum. And Birnbaum made it very clear. He said, I don't think it's at the level of the Jews as immoral people to judge all Germans collectively. As long as there's some doubt could exist in his mind that Balanik could be innocent of the worst crimes, he would treat him civilly, even if he didn't really embrace him. Where do I stand in this position? Fortunately, I'm not in a position where I have to deal with contemporary Yiddish Nazi scholars, but I find both the positions of both men, I understand them and I sympathize with them. I don't know how I would have responded if I were in 1953 having to deal with each of these people. I have the benefit of hindsight. I've plumbed the archives in about 5 countries, digging up Belenics records. I know what Weinreich and Birnbaum couldn't know. And that's simply, they were dealing with incomplete information. It's a very different situation they were facing.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Thank you very much. Okay, when we have another question from Michael Freidson. Didn't the German scholars need to read Hebrew in order to read Yiddish?
So here's an interesting story, and I highly recommend David Fischland's book on the book smugglers, which deals largely with the Rosenberg-Stab, the German team of scholars who plundered YIVO and other libraries in Vilna. There were very few German scholars who could read Yiddish and could read Hebrew. There were some. They were usually academics who were, ideological Nazis or who were recruited because they were trying to advance their careers. When they got to Vilna, for example, the Rosenberg-Stab relied on Jewish scholars to read things for them and to write their reports and pass it off in his own work. That is, they made slave laborers of Jewish scholars because they did not have the skills themselves to do their own research. There were not that many German scholars of Judaica who were really able to work competently with Hebrew sources and certainly not with Yiddish sources. So they had to rely to a large extent on Jews for this kind of work.
Okay, cool. Thank you very much. And I think the last question from Jean-Marie, I also send you to your direct chat so you can see. She says, I see that Mittelingen der Arbeitskast für Yadistic, ended in 1964. Were there any political reason behind its demise?
No, as far as I know, there wasn't. I mean, the story, I would love to uncover the full story, but I don't have access to the archives. I wrote to various archives in Germany about how Balanik got the funding for these things, because he had to write to the German authorities. And there was ambivalence amongst the German authorities after post-World War II towards all things Jewish. Eventually becoming philo-Semitic became the way to go, a way to curry favor with the Western allies and so on, to show that you're bona fides as an opponent of the Nazis. And they gave him money, but there's no trace that I could find, no money trail. I don't have the internal documentation telling this whole story. As far as I know, however, the simple answer to the question is that Balanik stopped publishing simply because he was too busy. He became a professor, which was his lifelong dream. He had failed in this attempt over the years, finally becomes a professor, and he simply didn't have the time. Really, Yiddish, and this is, I could tell you another lecture about the history of Yiddish studies, but that's not for today. Yiddish in Germany is a very small phenomenon post-World War II, apart from Balanik and maybe 1 or 2 other people who are interested, until the 1990s. It's the 1990s that we get state-funded chairs for Yiddish in a few universities, or money given by private foundations like Volkswagen to fund the chairs. And this is, why Germany really becomes in the 1990s one of the major centers for Yiddish research and has a very lively, active scene where new academics are being trained. But that's primarily a phenomenon of the 1990s. Balanik was largely a one-man show when he was working. in part because there weren't that many other scholars interested, in part because he didn't think highly enough of those who were active to really work with them.
Okay, thank you very much. Also, a few people are asking if you could write down the book you mentioned just a few minutes before.
Which group is that?
When I ask you about whenever German scholars had to know Hebrew in order to read Yiddish.
The Rosenberg-Stab. I mean, if I say it with less of an accent, a German accent, or whatever my accent is, Rosenberg, like the name Rosenberg, because Alfred Rosenberg was the Nazi ideologue who was the impetus for this organization. The name Rosenberg plus S-T-A-B, Stab, S-T-A-B.
And the books
they are the ones who were responsible for the pillaging and looting of YIVO. And as I said, I highly recommend David Fishman's book, The Book Smugglers, which came out a few years ago, which goes into great detail about its activities in Vilna. And I mentioned this guy, Paul, the librarian, who was one of these people who did know Hebrew, he was a librarian, but didn't really know Yiddish. You'll find a lot about his activities in Vilna, forcing Jews to work under him there.
Okay, lovely. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you for this wonderful presentation and answers to our questions. And now I will try to unmute you all. And if you would like to say a few words, like a thank you, or you have additional question, you will be able to.
Excellent. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And thank you all for coming.
Yes,
or sitting in your living rooms and listening.
Thank you so much. That was great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both for the scholastic and academic content, but also for your enthusiasm, which is infectious. It has reached a very cold, dark Scotland. Thank you very much.
You know, I think it's Glasgow that has the one Yiddish cafe in Europe. Is that, you know this place?
I don't, but I will certainly check on that and post something for you. That's much appreciated. Yeah. Thank you.
I've heard of it. There was an interesting article on maybe The Guardian about it some months back. So yeah.
Yeah, the Golden Peacock, something like this. Yeah, something very like yeah, very interesting story.
Yeah, fascinating.
Thank you from sunny Florida, but it's not sunny today.
Do you think there's going to be a revival of Yiddish on Staten Island?
Who asked that question?
Buy my brother's books. Buy my brother's books.
It's my brother. I didn't know he'd be listening. Yes. There's a lot to say about Staten Island, but I won't say it here.
Okay. Thank you all. Thank you, Kalman, for joining us this evening and morning or noon in Canada and Staten Island, and hope to see you again soon.
Okay. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Good night.